So hopefully you recall from the previous unit, the first 5 chapters, that some of the big concepts that we talked about is first that these colonists really consider themselves to be subjects of the royal crown. However, they truly feel as that they are a different group of people, that they are separate, and they've really been able to govern themselves pretty independent of the crown, and the crown hasn't been overly involved in the various goings on in the Americas. And that's partly because the crown has been very much engaged in conquest throughout the globe. There has been a lot of conflict globally, and that's really kept Great Britain busy. And now they've sort of turned their sights back to the colonies. But these American colonies have been pretty unchecked for more than 100 years. There have been various policies, taxes, rules in place to govern the Americas, but for the most part, those policies and rules have not been enforced. And so the colonists have really started to think of themselves as pretty independent. And in some regards, they are, but in other regards, they are not independent. At the same time, we've seen the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish engaging with natives and with each other throughout North America and certainly South America. And they've engaged to varying degrees and with varying degrees of success. But I mentioned that the colonists are starting to view themselves differently, particularly the British colonists. And we saw that play out with the Zinger case, where Americans, or colonists, I shouldn't say Americans just yet, where these colonists believe that they should be able to reject a law if truth is the guiding factor. And that's going to be very important because that's going to be part of what these colonists, later Americans, will focus on when they begin to draft their own laws. The British have implemented several plans over the course of a few years to try to bring the colonies into submission. And most of those plans include taxes in some fashion or another, different types of taxes. They also begin to send these colonial officials, royal officials, to the colonies, sometimes appointed in the colonies, sometimes being appointed from Great Britain, to ensure that taxes are paid, that duties are paid, that the colonies are, abiding by British rule. The other thing that they do is begin to conscript these colonial men into British service, particularly into the British Navy. And as time goes on, they extend some of their wartime policies into peacetime policies. And they do this, very much to the frustration of the colonies. And so ultimately, what we see is this boiling pot, if you will. And it's boiling and it's boiling and it's boiling. And for a second, you'll see that rumble sort of die down, and then it will, boil hot again. And so that brings us to where we are now with this boiling pot that sort of boils over. And a question that I want you to think about as we go through this particular chapter is, at what point do the colonies reach the point of no return in terms of they must leave Great Britain and be a separate people? Now, some would argue that they were always a separate people. Some would argue that they could have become subjects of the crown up until the moment that the war officially ended and peace was officially brokered. Others will say that there are different points in the fighting where, for colonists, this becomes a point of no return. It's important to keep in mind that through the Revolution, there are many colonists who believe that we, meaning, those in the United States, or what will become the United States, should never have left Great Britain. So this isn't just all colonists who suddenly decide they want to leave Great Britain and they begin to engage in the war. Okay, so that brings us to the question of independence. So the Sons of Liberty continued resistance, and they continue this resistance to British actions all the way up to the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The local militias begin to stockpile weapons very early on, and they begin to keep a close watch on the British troop movements. Women continue boycotts, and they also begin to make bandages and bullets. So this is a effort on the part of all colonists, not just fighting men or the wealthiest. Some northern colonists began to free their slaves as long as those slaves agreed to serve in the militia. This does not mean that all northern colonists freed slaves, but some do. On April 18th, 1775, the British troops left Boston and marched to Lexington and Concord to confiscate Patriot war materials that were stored there and to arrest the Patriot leaders. Now, this is very important because these Patriot leaders and these war materials are certainly a violation of British law. And so these troops are acting within their right as, officials for the crown. But the colonists certainly believe that they have a right to stockpile weapons. They believe that they have a right to distribute propaganda, particularly anti-British propaganda, and they believe they have a right to speak out against the crown. Paul Revere and others were able to spread the alarm, and they alerted the residents in Lexington and Concord. On April 19th, British troops encountered militiamen on Lexington's village green. 8 colonists were killed in a brief exchange before the troops moved on to Concord, where they burned the colonial supplies. Militiamen from neighboring towns harassed the British soldiers all the way back to Boston by hiding in trees and fences and firing on them as they marched. Eventually, they killed 73 of these British troops and wounded 200. Now, the word spread relatively quickly, and the Boston Patriots attacked the British soldiers, forcing their initial retreat onto the ships that were in the harbor. The British soon regained control of Boston, only to find out that the Patriot militiamen were entrenched in hills north of the city. Now, the Patriots really don't have the same manpower, the same weapons, and so they really have to be creative in how they engage in this battle. So that's where we see a lot of guerrilla warfare, a lot of stealth warfare. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont quickly captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York. And this is the official beginning of the War for Independence. But I want you to ask yourself, at this particular moment, can the colonists retreat and say, oops, we made a mistake, we don't want to be independent? Or with the killing of those 73 soldiers, is there no turning back from war? The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May. Certain delegates, like John Dickinson, wanted to step back and consider negotiation with Great Britain in order to prevent complete and total separation from the Crown. Others believed that independence was the only possible response now that this armed conflict had begun. On June 16th, British forces under the command of General William Howe dislodged the Patriots holding Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill just north of Boston. The British won at this particular moment when the Patriots ultimately just ran out of ammunition, but their victory was extremely costly. More than 1,000 British soldiers were either killed or wounded. The British held Boston, but the heavy losses incurred by the British encouraged the Patriots. The Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. On June 23rd, he left Philadelphia to take command of the troops in Boston. Washington had hoped that he could depend on the local militia leaders to accept his leadership, and he had to depend on the individual colonies to supply the troops. And some did not accept his leadership. Some did not accept the fact that there was one leader over different colonial units. Washington wrote dozens of letters to the Continental Congress delegates, to the Patriot leaders, and to others, begging for supplies and men. He tried to improve military discipline and order by replacing the incompetent officers and combating the troops' predilections for drinking, gambling, and fighting with other militiamen from other areas. What we see is that often militias from the same colony would be engaged in conflict with one another. And then we also see that there would be conflict between the militiamen from one colony and the next. Washington and his officers developed a two-pronged military strategy. The first was to drive the British out of Boston. The second was to capture Canada to prevent an attack from the north. In November of 1775, Patriot General Richard Montgomery captured Montreal, but the cold weather, an outbreak of smallpox, and the lack of reinforcements doomed the Patriots' attack on Quebec. General Henry Knox retrieved cannons that were captured from Fort Ticonderoga to shore up the Patriot defenses in Boston. The Battle of Dorchester Heights, Washington surprised the British with a cannon bombardment. This drove the British out of Boston and into Nova Scotia. Now, if you're curious, you will notice that I mentioned General Richard Montgomery, and he is indeed the General Richard Montgomery, the Revolutionary War brigadier, who Montgomery County, where we are, was named for. Obviously, the naming came a little bit later, but nonetheless, that's a little piece of local history for you. Moving on. War spread into Virginia by 1775 as Lord Dunmore, who was the colony's royal governor, sought refuge on British warships in the Norfolk Harbor. He encouraged slaves and servants to join him, and thousands did. When Dunmore led his army at the Battle of the Great Bridge in November of 1775, many black men fought alongside the British troops. After reclaiming the governor's mansion, Dunmore issued a proclamation that guaranteed freedom to any slave or indentured servant who agreed to fight for the British. Dunmore's proclamation alarmed the Patriot leaders because it complicated the drive for independence. Plantation owners and other wealthy men, many of whom were delegates to the Second Continental Congress, did not want to upset the existing social and economic hierarchy in the process of securing independence. Many colonists still hoped for a negotiated settlement, but those hopes were quickly receded when Parliament and the King refused to compromise. They cut off trade and prohibited negotiations with the colonies that December of 1775. Calls for independence intensified in the early part of 1776, with the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense becoming a bestseller quickly. Independence became a greater possibility as the colonies began to instruct their delegates at the Second Continental Congress to support complete separation from Great Britain. The Congress officially asked France for military support and economic support and advised the colonies to establish governments independent of Great Britain. The spread of war and the argument set forth in Common Sense convinced many that it was time to declare independence. In June of 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion for independence in the Continental Congress. After much debate, the Congress appointed John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to write a formal statement justifying independence. Now, you've probably heard of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, but you may not remember or have heard of Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston. You want to be familiar with those 5 names. Now, Thomas Jefferson became the lead writer, and he drew on ideas from a variety of sources, from Thomas Paine to the many declarations written by local groups and colonial assemblies. Many of those documents drew upon the writings of John Locke. You'll remember that John Locke argued that sovereignty rested with the people, and thus the people could change any government that abused its powers and threatened their right to life, liberty, and property. John Locke's principles of sovereignty became a central argument in what would become the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was debated and edited by the Second Continental Congress. Ultimately, all references to slavery were removed. But listed among the king's abuses was a charge of inciting, quote, domestic insurrections among us, end quote, which was a reference to Dunmore's proclamation. So ultimately, while slavery is not mentioned in the Declaration or later the Constitution, the writers are thinking about slavery. And specifically when they address these domestic insurrections that the king is inciting, they are saying that because of Dunmore's proclamation, which granted freedom to a runaway slave, the crown is really undermining the colony's ability to live as they choose. All colonies, with the exception of New York, approved the Declaration on July 2nd, 1776. The Declaration was made public on July 4th. Now, a question to think about is, why did New York not approve the Declaration? Now, New York would eventually give support, but the delegates couldn't give their support until July 9th. And they couldn't do this because their home assembly had not actually authorized them to vote in favor of independence. Now, again, this is important because it really demonstrates the lack of 100% solidarity in separating from Great Britain that we often think of as synonymous with the Revolution and the Declaration. We celebrate independence on July 4th, which is the day that the Declaration was made public, but not the actual day that it was signed. Now, we are able to, well, there we go. We are able to ultimately get this declaration signed. And now, as colonists, soon to be Americans, we have to figure out how we're going to manage to get enough support to actually win this war. Before the outbreak of the war, patriots and loyalists had chosen sides. Patriots organized local communities, courts, and assemblies to govern the colonies as they shed British rule. Servants and slaves fled to British warships or marched with British troops in Virginia. Mohawk loyalists, led by Joseph Brant, relocated to Canada with 120 British loyalists and the British Superintendent for Indian Affairs, Guy Johnson. Representatives from the Continental Congress, recognizing the importance of Indian support, met with the Iroquois Confederacy in August of 1775. Some Oneida Indians wanted to support the colonies, but most wanted to remain neutral. Once the Declaration of Independence was signed and made public, the pressure to choose sides increased, particularly among the civilian population. Loyalist civilians were able to resettle in New York, Newport, and Charleston because the British controlled those cities throughout most of the war. Men of fighting age reinforced British troops, but others, particularly women, were at very great risk. Without the support of the British troops, loyalists were attacked and had their homes ransacked. Loyalists came from all social and economic classes. Many tenants in the Hudson Valley in New York were loyalists because their landlords were patriots. In the South, the former regulators joined forces with the British in opposition to North Carolina's Eastern elite, toward whom they were still very hostile. Most Indian nations sided with the British. The Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cherokee, and the Creek nations were some of Britain's most important allies. Most Indian nations believed that Great Britain offered them the best chance to secure their territory in North America, in spite of the failure of that proclamation line from 1763. Now, the natives are not naive. They know that as long as the colonists are in North America, they will be at risk of losing territory. But their hope is that if they support the British in bringing the colonies back into submission, that Britain will not allow the colonists to continue to extend into the western part of the country. They know that the colonists will continue to encroach upon their land. They hope that the British will not allow that if the British are victorious. Now, many Indian nations like the Delaware and the Shawnee tried to remain neutral, but when patriots refused to recognize their neutrality, even killing the Shawnee chief Cornstalk under a flag of truce, they ultimately sided with the British as well. Colonists who chose neutrality for religious reasons were threatened. 80,000 Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, Shakers, and Moravians, the majority of whom were in Pennsylvania, embraced pacifism and refused to take up arms or pay taxes to support the war. But their pacifism made them suspect to both sides. In 1778, 9 Mennonite farmers refused to swear allegiance to Pennsylvania's new revolutionary government. They were jailed, and their property and possessions were confiscated and sold. Now, this is important because one of the things that will be written in the American Constitution is that you can't have your property confiscated for no reason. Quakers were also fined and imprisoned, and those Quakers who supported one side or the other were often disowned or disciplined by the Quaker meetings for violating the Quaker principles. Betsy Ross and her husband were among those that were so affected. Once independence was declared, all those who actively supported the American cause would be considered traitors if the Patriots did not win. Soldiers' families were particularly affected as the Continental Army took them further and further from home. Old men and young boys were the only protection left behind for local communities. Some women accompanied their husbands as camp followers. These women cooked, did laundry, and sewed clothes for the soldiers. They gathered information and supported their husbands and their fellow soldiers. Some women remained at home and worked to raise money, collect information, and sent supplies to the front line. Desperately short of supplies, the Continental Army asked Northern women to make clothes and Southern women to plant crops for food. Women in Hartford, Connecticut produced 1,000 coats and vests and 16,000 shirts in 1 year. Other women converted their homes into makeshift hospitals, nursing soldiers with battle wounds and various diseases. African American women, such as Phyllis Wheatley of Boston, supported the Patriots. Wheatley sent a collection of poems to General Washington and urged her readers to see Africans as children of God. Wheatley was freed by her master, but she was an exception. Most Black Americans remained enslaved in the South, other than those slaves who were initially freed by the British. En route from Boston to New York in 1776, many soldiers in Washington's army deserted, believing that New Yorkers should defend New York. Now, this is a very important battle that Washington has to fight through the duration of the war. Many soldiers believe that they should defend their home state or colony, but they don't necessarily want to die for another colony. Those who remained with Washington were mostly the landless laborers, whose wives also came along as camp followers, much to Washington's dismay. These landless laborers had no home to return to. They had no job at home that they could go back to, and their wives were right there with them. And so they were more apt to stay. Washington arrived in New York with about 19,000 poorly armed and poorly trained soldiers, some of whom had been drafted into service by their local leaders. In New York, the Continentals faced a larger and better trained British army. While the powerful British Navy was anchored in the New York harbor off of the coast of Long Island. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence, General Howe had ordered 10,000 troops to occupy New York in hope that such an overwhelming show of force would convince the Continental Congress to accept his offer of a royal pardon. It did not. Howe's plan was to control New York City and march up the Hudson Valley, isolating New York and New England from the colonies. He had the support of about 8,000 Hessian mercenaries and naval reinforcements. When the British engaged the Continental Army on Long Island in August of 1776, more than 1,500 of Washington's troops were killed or wounded. By November, the British had captured Fort Lee in New Jersey and attacked the Patriot Army at Fort Washington, north of New York City. Aided by a large community of loyalists, Howe's men raided and looted the homes and businesses of local patriots. Washington's army escaped into Pennsylvania, and the Continental Congress fled Philadelphia for Baltimore. Howe hoped to wear the Continental Army down rather than pursue an aggressive military strategy. He wanted the colonies to sue for peace, or to recognize that they had been defeated, that they could not win, and to beg for peace. Washington hoped that by avoiding a full-scale frontal assault, he would be able to convince the British that the colonies would be too difficult to defeat. Between July and December of 1776, the Continental Army did not win a single battle. Howe decided not to pursue Washington into Pennsylvania, choosing instead to set up winter quarters in New York and wait until the spring to fight again. This was European tradition. This plan allowed Washington time to regroup, but he was not looking forward to facing the winter with troops who were suffering from very low morale. Crossing the Delaware River from eastern Pennsylvania, Washington successfully attacked the Hessian troops in Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas Eve in 1776. On January 3rd, the Continentals defeated the British at Princeton. The British retreated from New Jersey, and the Continental Congress came back to Philadelphia. Now, this was a significant moment for the Continental soldiers because this gave them hope that they could be successful. In the spring of 1776, the British Army was concentrated in New York and Canada, and the Continental Army was in Morristown, New Jersey. The Continental Congress was afraid that the British would try to capture Philadelphia and split the colonies in half. Howe believed that the capture of Philadelphia would cause Washington to surrender. The Continental Army, though too small to defeat Howe's army, delayed Howe's march from New York to Philadelphia through repeated attacks. Howe received an order from General John Burgoyne to reinforce, whose forces were moving south from Canada, but he didn't turn around to reinforce those troops. He continued on to Philadelphia, incurring those small attacks from Washington's men. He continued to Philadelphia and captured the city in 1777. Although Burgoyne recaptured Fort Ticonderoga in July, his forces stalled because they were waiting for supplies and reinforcements. General Barry St. Leger was moving east through New York with the help of local Indians to support Burgoyne. But St. Leger suffered a major defeat at the hands of the German-American farmers who were led by General Nicholas Herkimer. With the help of the reinforcements who were under the leadership of General Benedict Arnold, by the end of August, the British and Indian troops had to retreat into Canada. With no help from St. Leger or Howe, Burgoyne's troops faced the Continental Army, the Green Mountain Boys, and the Oneida Allies. General Arnold and General Horatio Gates defeated Burgoyne in 2 battles at Freeman's Farm. Burgoyne surrendered to Gates at what was known as the Battle of Saratoga. The American victory at the Battle of Saratoga encouraged the Patriots and stunned the British. It undercut Howe's capture of Philadelphia and indicated that Howe had failed to understand the nature of the American Revolution. The American troops settled in at Valley Forge for the winter. Washington was encouraged, as were members of the very dislocated Continental Congress. Benjamin Franklin, already in Paris, now had a much greater hope of securing help from the French. Here you can see these red lines, these red arrows that indicate the movements of the British forces. And you can also see the American forces here in this blue, on this blue line. And we know that the British forces certainly have the ability to be more heavily armed. However, they do have some disadvantages. One, they're very disconnected from the leadership in Great Britain. The ability to be resupplied is difficult. And importantly, the British soldiers are really fighting because they're being told to fight. The Patriot soldiers are fighting because they believe they are fighting for their home, their territory, their livelihood. And so they have some different motivations. Despite the victories in the fall of 1777, the winter at Valley Forge almost doomed the Patriot effort. The bitter cold, inadequate food and clothing, and poor training led to a breakdown in discipline. Benjamin Franklin recruited Baron Frederick von Steuben to drill the army in the winter. Other Europeans also helped the Patriots. Although the army still had many problems with discipline, the foreign volunteers and Washington's leadership helped the Patriot cause. Women and families on the home front also suffered in 1777 and 1778. In Philadelphia, British soldiers commandeered private homes. Women whose husbands fought in the Continental Army had to provide for themselves and their families. Many women founded voluntary associations like the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia. to help provide resources for the army in hopes that they would shorten the conflict. Camp followers provided vital services to the army and suffered alongside them. They were cooks, laundresses, seamstresses, and nurses. They also benefited from supplies like clothing and bedding, which were sent by urban women. Courageous women with resources acted as spies and couriers for both armies. They eavesdropped on the enemy conversations and passed along the information that they had gathered. In one case, a Georgia woman tricked Tory soldiers into losing sight of their guns and killed two of them before her neighbors arrived to hang the others. Women like Margaret Corbin followed their husbands onto the battlefield and took over their positions when their husbands were killed. Others, like Deborah Sampson, dressed as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army.